It's Wednesday, September 18th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Climate Week Day 3, folks. We'll start with a look at what global warming is doing to the waters around us. Then a word on some nature-based solutions when it comes to climate change and the business of it. What makes dollars and cents? Like I said, welcome to Climate Week Day 3. So this whole week, we are speaking with folks engaged in solutions when it comes to the global climate crisis and what it means for us here in Newfoundland and Labrador. I've been getting some great notes through the week, and we will share them on tomorrow's show. Tomorrow, by the way, full call-in show. We're asking, here's the question ahead of time. What ocean changes have you noticed over the years in Newfoundland and Labrador and in and around the ocean? And if you have solutions or ideas for us, get in touch. So that's tomorrow. In the meantime, if you want to send us an email on anything this week, including those questions I just asked, the signal at cbc.ca. You can call the Signal line and leave a message, 709-576-5260. And you can always text us. Any show, during the show, the text line is always open for your thoughts. 709-327-8206. We're going to kick things off. I've got a couple guests in studio, which we will get to shortly. But here's a word from a climatologist who came to visit me for a chat just a couple days ago.
I'm Joel Finis. I am trained as a climatologist, and I currently work with the Department of Geography here at Memorial University.
Thanks for coming back onto the program, Joel. Talk to me about making sense of climate risks these days and what you're looking at.
Okay, so this is something we've talked about a few times in the past. Honestly, the main headlines are the same. Climate continues to change, and there are, as a result, various different risks that we as a society are facing. Now, those risks differ from one place to another. But we see that across Canada, there are certain things that keep coming up. It's recurring massive forest fire seasons. I mean, we haven't quite had the same national level emergency that we had a few years ago, where we were actually stretching our forest fighting capacity very thin across multiple fires in multiple provinces. But you're still seeing that the seasons are starting earlier, and there's still quite a few significant events in any given year. And there's no reason to believe that that's going to change in the near future as all these ecosystems adapt to changes that have already arrived, more or less. But we're starting to see some other things shifting as well, right? So back in 2007, I would say that the first real indication that maybe we needed to think about climate change as something that we were underestimating showed up with a dramatic crash in sea ice volume in the Arctic. That has persisted. But now we're also seeing that something seems to be up with North Atlantic circulation potentially that is quite alarming. We've seen sea surface temperatures across the North Atlantic that have, for the last 2 years, been not just high, but unthinkably high. Statistically, impossibly high sea surface temperatures averaged over this large area. We've got a bunch of different people looking at why that is and different factors that are contributing to it. But ultimately, what it comes down to is we don't know why that's happening. It's, again, an indication that the climate is going to continue to surprise us in the next few years.
I know when you go into science, a part of it is figuring out the world, right? But when we talk about climate change and we talk about that big body of water just next to us, and when there's things that are unthinkably we never thought of could happen before, but here it is, we don't know why. What's that like to be in your position, trying to figure it out and talking to others about just what it could mean and how it can impact us?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of different levels there, right? As a scientist doing your work, you look at it and you think, well, okay, these are places to focus some research energy, right? So it opens up questions, it opens up research ideas. It galvanizes some activity. On a personal level, it's, of course, one of those things where you look at it and you can't help but feel worried about a lot of it, right? So yes, there's that mixture of very personal, well, what's going on? What does the future hold? What's coming next? And on the other side, hey, there's all kinds of research questions that we should be organizing around.
Yeah, so this, when it comes to the part of like asking about informing responses for regular folks, and I'm including myself in this, how should we be thinking about this and looking at it?
Right. Well, I mean, the real answer there is that we need to address climate change collectively and decisively immediately. Right. And that requires some personal considerations, yes. But I think more importantly, it requires that we start pushing elected officials, governments at all different levels to take serious action on this and to hold to some of the promises they've already made. So, I mean, we live in a city that has declared a climate crisis back in 2019. We live in a province that is thinking a lot about what its adaptation strategy should be. We're living in a country where the federal government is trying to take action on curbing fossil fuel emissions and consumption. And honestly, what it comes down to is making sure that as we re-elect government officials, we're holding to those promises, we're pushing them to do more, because frankly, even with the targets that have been set so far, we're not going to address this problem unless we take even more stringent steps.
Joel Finis, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And as Professor Finis was leaving, he also told me this point. He said, remind folks, we know what's causing this problem. We have some agency when it comes to the climate changing, when it comes to global warming, which puts a lot of this problem under our control. Speaking of control and solutions, I've got Carissa Brown here, professor of biogeography, as well as grad student Pierrette Jane Bourque. PJ, welcome. Welcome to you both. How you both doing?
Great. Thanks for having us.
All right. So thoughts on what Professor Finis, on what Joel was saying there to jump off this part of the conversation?
It's always great to hear Joel talk about those things. I learn something every time he speaks about it.
Oh, gosh,
so
same.
Happy to listen.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me was Joel talking about these unexpected things happening. And what that speaks to me is that climate changes aren't happening in a straight line. So we can't have kind of straight line expectations of how things are going to change and how we adapt to them. We are going to have more of these anomalies. We're going to have more variation in what we're experiencing. And so we need to have a diversity of solutions on the go to be more resilient to those changes. If we plan for one outcome that we think might happen, if we have a swing in conditions and that's not the outcome we have, then we're kind of have a bit of a problem. And so having a diversity of options, a diversity of solutions happening with plants, obviously, because we're talking to me.
Yes.
But in all aspects of climate change planning and adaptation and mitigation, I think that's really key, is that we have to be prepared for the unexpected.
Tell folks a bit more of professor of biogeography. It's not something I would have known about growing up, but seeing you've been on the show a few times, I'm getting a better and better idea after each time we talk, but just give us some more info around it.
Sure. I also didn't know about it when I was growing up. Biogeography is just studying why species occur where they do and when they do. And what I'm interested in particular, and a lot of us in our research group in geography in the Northern Edge Lab are interested in, is why aren't species moving and expanding their ranges as we would expect under ongoing climate change? So we kind of thought decades ago, I'm using we as a bigger global we here.
The global we.
The global we, that things were going to warm up and species would expand their ranges to match those climate conditions that they'd been adapted to. But it's way more complicated than that. There's more fire activity. There's some species move faster than others. Some species require a certain partner to move together. So if you're a flower that is only pollinated by one species of bee, you need that bee to expand its range as well. And so we have all these mismatches between how species are moving and how climate is changing. And so that means in a place like Newfoundland, on the island itself, where it's very hard for species that aren't already here to get here, unless we bring them ourselves, that means that maybe some warmer adapted species haven't gotten here yet, but maybe they might actually do okay here in the future.
The complexity of it. How hard is it to get that across to folks, for everyone to, that we of us all understanding just where things are headed with climate change, right? With this crisis that's going on globally, and to understand that, gosh, this is really, really hard.
My best kind of analogy is to think about just an individual, either yourself or a tree or a caribou or whatever. What does that individual need to have a successful life and pass on its genetic material and sustain a population there? So an individual needs a safe place to kind of transition from a baby into adulthood. It needs the right things to eat. It needs to not get poisoned. It needs to not get eaten by something else. It needs water to drink, and it needs some kind of shelter. And then it needs others around for reproduction, to make seeds or to make baby caribou or whatever. And so if you think about all those different things on that list, the only thing that's really kind of directly related to climate change is maybe those right environmental conditions, that sort of temperature and amount of moisture maybe. But there's all these other things that an individual needs to live and succeed. And so if we think about everything that we need, the right temperature is just one part of that.
Now you're making it sound easier. PJ, what about yourself? Either thoughts on what we've had so far in the conversation, or just on why you want to study what you're studying?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about what got me interested in this kind of research. Happy to elaborate on my research as well. I grew up in New Brunswick, so I'm originally from New Brunswick, and it's very forested there. And so I've always had this like connection with nature and the trees and spending time outside. And I think, kind of as Joel was saying and Carissa is saying, we've seen a lot of changes over the last few years. And as someone that really cares about the environment, I've started to get concerned about what that could mean long term with climate change. And so it's been really nice to be here at Memorial University in the geography department, working towards some potential solutions. As Carissa was saying, I also feel that we need to look and kind of investigate a lot of different avenues when it comes to climate change. So it's been exciting to be a part of that so far.
So when you're out talking to your friends, your social circle, or your family, what are climate change conversations like as someone who's involved in the study of it and solutions and the area that you're in compared to what other folks are saying kind of in your circles?
That's a good question. I think I'm fortunate to have a lot of like really supportive people in my circles. So generally I tell them a little bit about my work. So like Carissa was saying, there's some concerns about species moving their ranges. And so my project is looking at what if we moved some of those species. So if we looked at species that need to move northward but can't, and then we move them onto the island of Newfoundland, are they ready? Are they suitable for the growing conditions here? So I've been exploring that at the Munn Botanical Gardens, and I think a lot of people in my life have found that quite exciting.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's super interesting research. I'm very excited to see where the project leads. But yeah, just kind of exploring kind of what that next step looks like.
Fine crowd to work with up there at the Botanical Garden from Memorial University, too.
They're pretty awesome.
All right, we've got some tape I want to play, too, because so you're here, but there was someone else who was going to be here, but they are actually in the field doing field work today, so they came in early with Joel. Take a listen.
I'm Rea Cali. I'm a PhD student here at Memorial University, and I'm doing my PhD in nature-based solutions here in Newfoundland, the island specifically.
All right, so explain that to me so I can understand exactly what it is and what it means.
Yeah, of course. So we hear a lot about the term nature-based solutions, and I think it's a huge umbrella term, and it's been described as essentially looking into restoring natural or modified ecosystems. So for me specifically, what that looks like is looking into coastal vegetation. So I'm more on the land side aspect of nature-based solutions. And I look at vegetation here on the Avalon specifically to use it as a way to mitigate coastal erosion. So I look at what grows here and also how we can plant it along the coastline and kind of help, again, keep that land there and not erode too much.
Yeah. So, you're looking at what gets grown and how that can help from the coast just dissolving and disappearing, right? So keep it together.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people are actually doing that already. They don't really know exactly maybe the ways to do it or what species to use, but they're already doing it. I've met people along last summer when I was doing my field work, and they were talking to me and being like, oh, I've planted, some vegetation on my property because I've seen that erosion is happening and I want to do something about it. So it's great. I love it.
Yeah, because you're like, wait a minute, that's what I'm studying, and this is fantastic.
Yeah, so it'd be awesome to find, the ideal species. I mean, ideally, hopefully, find some species that can work here, and just, let people know what to plant in their backyards if they want to do it, like community-led kind of.
When this interview airs, you will be not in St. John's because you'll be doing something. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I'll be doing field work with my lab mate, Amy, and we're going to go on the west coast of Newfoundland, and her research is on black ash. So we're going to be looking for little baby black ash trees just around Corner Brook and Deer Lake, and kind of a little bushwhacking and going in the middle of the forest, hopefully no bears.
Looking for little ash trees.
Yeah.
Excellent. Why did you get into this field of study?
Okay, well, I kind of have to go back to my childhood.
Sure.
I grew up in Barbados, which is an island in the Caribbean, and so I've always been kind of close to the ocean and just really loved anything to do with the ocean and the coastline. I then did an internship with their coastal zone management unit back in 2020, I want to say. And we were just looking at the coastlines that were eroding, and they had planted actually a kind of tropical version of beach pea, and they had used that as a nature-based solutions to help with the sand that was eroding there. So I just really thought that was super cool, and I wanted to do my research in something adjacent to that. So I was very lucky to find this project here.
And to be doing this with everything that's going on, right? With everything that Joel Finis was talking about earlier. What's it like to be working in this area in sciences in this crucially important time of trying to figure out how to adapt, mitigate, and also looking for climate solutions?
It can be a little scary, but I find it super inspiring, just looking at solutions that can help the climate crisis. And I work in an environment where a lot of people are doing this, and I feel like there's still hope there. There's a lot of people who want to do this and do research and understand that something needs to be done. So I know it can be scary and daunting and kind of put you in a bit of a crisis mode about the climate changing. We need that. We need the emergency of having to do something about it. But there's also hope there, and I feel like we can have a bright future if we work together.
Thanks for this.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Marina Cuselli there. Marina's on the West Coast doing some field work today. Carissa PJ, any thoughts on what Marina was saying there?
I really liked how Marina kind of spoke about how climate change can be scary, but there's so many exciting things happening as well. It can be super inspiring to work in this field and to look into some of those possible solutions, especially when you get some of those positive outcomes with her work doing coastal erosion and seeing what kind of plants to be planting along coastlines. Very exciting stuff.
Yeah, it makes a difference, right?
Yeah.
Just like, wait, the thing that perhaps in what she was saying too, like going to meet folks who are already doing some of this and then to study it and then to say, this makes a difference. This is keeping some of the coast from eroding in a time when coastal erosion is a big, big issue. Is it empowering to do this kind of, like, what does it feel for both of you to be doing this type of work and research in the solutions department around climate change?
Yeah, I find it super empowering and inspiring. It's kind of like Marina was saying, it's awesome to see so many people already interested when you go out into different communities and kind of working on some of these solutions. And then being a woman working with a woman in a lab has been very inspiring as well, just being a female in the STEM world. Yeah, I don't know if you want to speak more to that, Carissa.
Well, thank you, first of all. One of the things that Marina said there about coming across people in the community, that's really rewarding because that was kind of one of the original ideas behind her project was that, again, talking about a suite of solutions.
Yeah.
We know that Newfoundland is a lot of rocks. We know that plants are not going to necessarily hold those rocks together, but there are areas where plants are a good solution and a very low-cost solution and a solution that communities can enact themselves. And it is the potentially one step in a suite of solutions for mitigating against coastal erosion. So green solutions combined with hard structures. Or if there isn't enough funding in an area, maybe starting with green solutions to slow down erosion while you work towards a combined solution. So knowing that folks are doing that really reinforces that what Marina is producing is going to give a really useful tool to communities around Newfoundland. So that's fantastic. To answer the question about what it feels like to work on these things, the fear of climate change and outcomes can be overwhelming for folks. And I think doing something, even if it seems like something small, helps to stem that fear a bit. And so by doing things, by doing actions, even if it's something in your backyard, even if it's changing how you get to work, you're doing something that's going to push back against that fear that you might have for the future, for future generations.
Before you came here today, what were you doing?
I was staring up at trees.
How typical.
Typical, on brand. I was out to the folks that live in kind of the neighborhood off of Elizabeth near Memorial University. If you were wondering who those folks were, standing at the edges of your yards, staring up at trees, that was me and the undergrad biogeography class. We were assessing one small portion of the urban forest of St. John's. And so urban forests themselves are a great way to help mitigate against climate change. They are a climate solution in themselves. And my colleague Mahyar Masoudi has been here talking about this before. But not only can they help cool cities, they can take up carbon, they also just make us feel better. Being around trees and green spaces can help our physical and mental health, which maybe also puts us in a better place to work on other climate solutions. And so we were out just getting the students familiar with the urban forests in St. John's, what kinds of species are growing and how they're doing.
I really grew to appreciate urban forests after living in a couple of very big concrete-y cities.
Yeah.
And being there for summer, and then coming back home anyways, sure, but then just appreciating some of the growth and looking and the feel and smell and all of everything that you just laid out, because it's something that, I don't know, without that extra perspective, maybe I don't know if I would have quite gotten there as quickly or for when I did. We're almost out of time because you're both part one of the show, and we've got a whole business discussion to happen for part two. I see one of the guests just outside there. I think the other just pulled up. But before we get to that, any final thoughts for either just something you're thinking about now, or for folks for understanding, or something about the work you're doing, or a look ahead before I let you go today?
I would just say keep tuning into this show this week to figure out kind of what are the actions. He gave me $5 to say that. What are the kind of actions that as individuals we can do in our own daily life? And what are the kinds of, like Joel mentioned, what are the kinds of messages that we want to be communicating to our representatives in provincially and federally to start to make real changes, large-scale changes that will move us in the right direction under the context of climate change.
Yeah, because we're kind of like, all in this thing together, hey? Like it or not.
Like it or not.
Yeah,
Right. It's
like Joel was saying, it's that collective group effort to move forward with climate solutions.
Right. This is great. So now, is it teaching now? Like, what's the rest of your day like? Are you going back to the Botanical Garden? What's happening?
I'm headed up to the Botanical Gardens this afternoon.
Say hi to the crowd for me.
I
Carissa?
And I wish I was heading to the Botanical Gardens, but I'm doing some teaching prep, yep.
Teaching prep. All right. Look, thank you. And thanks to the Geography Department for the show we did a little while ago, and also for the contributions for this week. It's much, much, much appreciated. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Always fun
thanks
to
for
chat.
having us.
All right. See you, folks. All right. John Pike there with the moody connecting music, keeping stuff on point here as we've got some guests leaving the studio, some guests coming into the studio. I'm Adam Walsh. This is The Signal. It is Climate Week Day 3, right? So each day this week we've been talking to folks about solutions, talking to folks we had activists to begin the week, advocates. Yesterday we did a full gardening day / farming with a climate lens. Everything, though, it's about pushing the communities we live in, the conversations we're having in a forward direction for climate change, right? For the climate emergency that is happening, for climate emergencies all over the world and the climate crisis. So that's where we are right now. And we just talked to the crowd from the geography department at MUN, right? We have Professor of Biogeography, Carissa Brown, and grad student Pierrette Jane Bourque, who was here. We also heard from Joel Finis, the climatologist. And now let's get down to the business side of the discussion. I've got Professor John Peters here, Faculty of Business Administration and the Department of Sociology. How you doing?
Not too bad. How you doing, Adam?
I'm doing good. Let's just turn on your mic. We got the thumbs up on your mic. So tell me about yourself and what you're teaching over at the university, and we'll dive into the climate change discussion.
Well, it's not only about business, of course.
Yeah.
It's also about workers, and it's about unions, and it's about government. And I think one of the things I teach over in the Masters of Employment Relations program is about how we can bring everybody together and start talking about how we're going to build, and do this in a way that everyone's going to get good jobs, that we're going to get the training, and that we're going to get the infrastructure and the technologies developed, as well as the transit systems, to make sure that we actually do have a clean energy economy, right? So this is the big challenge, because it's not just about stopping things now. It's about how we try and go about building a clean energy economy that everyone's going to benefit from. And that's the big challenge ahead of us.
Tell me about your life. Your previous job way back, what was it?
I was a pipeline construction worker.
There we go.
Saskatchewan, Alberta. Pipeline on and off for about 15, 16 years.
15, 16 years.
And it was a family trade. So my father was a pipeliner for 50 years. My brother was a pipeliner for about 20 plus years, right? So yes, we all have our fingers in building infrastructure.
So then with that family trade and what you were doing, how do you transition from doing that to, I know there's a lot of hard work involved, but how do you transition from that to who you are right now?
Well, you look at what the trajectories of the kind of the work is and how and who's getting the benefit from it. You look at the sort of working conditions that are there. And that, I would say, certainly was enough of a spur for me to say, I think I need a different career. And I need to sort of look at what's happening in terms of our work and how we get better work out of those kinds of construction jobs, however much they might be needed, right? And then the other part of it was really, of course, this was all unionized work in some sense.
Yeah.
And it was big construction jobs. It meant a lot for communities. It meant a lot for the province, right? But if you looked at it, even from what the workers were getting versus what the oil companies were taking away and what the environmental damage was, it was no contest, right? Someone was taking all the benefit, and we were just getting left with a little bit of the crumbs and then left with the consequences in behind it as well.
What's it like when you have conversations around what we're talking about now with family and friends that you grew up with from the family trade?
You'd see a split decision, right? So my brother has quit the trade entirely, primarily not only because of the nature of the work conditions that are involved in it, but also because of the environmental damage. My father has finally shifted, saying that, we have to do something. The problem is that he doesn't think we're ever going to get there in any way, shape, or form. These are still good jobs for people, and it's going to be really hard to convince lots of the brothers and sisters to be able to make that trade and make that transition. Saying that, I do know that there's more than a few trades, whether it's in the plumbers and pipe fitters and welders, or whether it's in the electricians, whether it's in the transit drivers or the truck drivers, whether it's in the service workers. We've spoken to all these unions out in Saskatchewan as well as Alberta, and all of them are very interested in saying, what do we got to do? We want to make a trade. We want to make a change. How are we going to make that happen? How can we begin to have those kinds of discussions so that we can be at the forefront, as opposed to simply, being the sort of the passive victims here in this transition? Yeah,
and to take the skills that folks have now,
exactly,
and to move with this transition, and to say, hey, we want good paying jobs to feed our families with benefits and everything else. on the other side of where we're going here.
Yeah.
And where we are right now.
Yeah, and exactly.
Right.
And we want it without forest fires. We want it without air pollution, right? We want it without floods. We want it without it, right? Without having to sort of pay, having to try and rebuild our communities after this. And I think, you talk to people at the end of the day, they also want cheaper energy. We're supposed to have, being an oil and gas producing country, but yet we have some of the highest prices for oil and gas. And who's paying? All of us are paying every time we go to the pump and every time we heat our houses, right? So, yeah.
Tom Cooper's here as well. How you doing? Also from the Faculty of Business Administration. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Adam. Nice to see you, John.
Nice to see you, Tom.
Yeah, so thanks for being part of part two of the discussion, right? Because we had the geography discussion with the first part of the show, and now this business discussion, and both are super important, I think, as we look at climate change, the climate emergency, and the way forward. We've just started talking about this, but, Tom, I'll bring the same thing to you. In this time of climate change, where does business come into things in your mind?
I think business is absolutely vital in terms of climate change and making sure that business organizations are incentivized. And Adam and John knows this very well. The profit motive that most businesses have to operate under because of the nature of their incorporation documents and how they're structured doesn't always allow for sometimes long-term strategic thinking that you need to have in this transition. That being said, if business puts in the proverbial heel in the ground and say, I'm not moving, we don't move as a transition. Now, you've seen, and John knows this probably better than I do, but if you look at some of the jurisdictions that we see in the world, like, for example, the Biden administration in the United States, the amount of money they've given towards the energy transition has been very, very significant. Now, the question then will become, where is this being spent? Is this sustainable? Is this really moving organizations, especially fossil fuel producing companies, into the next transition? So for me, what I'm really excited by is more and more businesses are being required through regulation, through investors, stakeholder activism, to be able to report on what they're trying to do around this transition, which is manifested in ESG, so environmental, social, governance reporting. What's exciting for me is it's relatively new, probably around 2015 that we really started to see the change in this, and it's gone up quite dramatically, especially in Europe. The counter to that, you could say, well, Tom, it's 10 years. We still haven't made a lot of transition. If we look at financial reporting, that took 60, 70 years to really kind of get to the point where we have global national standards. So for me, the exciting part is that we're at the beginning. I like to always be at the beginning of stuff and looking at the beginning of stuff. But yeah, business, this is what happens when you invite professors onto the radio.
This is why I'm only giving you both half an hour. So, but that being said, we still have a good 20 minutes to film.
Right.
So,
there you go. So it's a long answer to a short question. So I think business is essentially vital. And speaking to a lot of business leaders, I think they get it. Yeah. It's just it's where it is on their agenda. Mm-hmm. And the World Economic Foundation, which is the Davos crew, which is sometimes people say, who are they? They're the people that meet every year. They publish a really, really great global risks facing business and organizations, et cetera.
I've looked at it before.
Yeah, and it's
fascinating.
It's something I use in my courses, something I use in executive training, something I use in other work that I do. And climate change is top of mind, and it's changed dramatically. It has gone further and further in terms of being one of the most major risks for organizations. Business organizations worry about risk. They worry about how to manage risk, and they worry about environmental and the implications of environmental risk. So for me, that transition, where we can start to mitigate some of those environmental risks, getting out of fossil fuels, getting out of trying to mitigate, I'm not sure you can really, John. What would you say, mitigating some of the environmental change that we've done, environmental disasters that we've created? But it's got onto corporate agendas. They're talking about it, and they're trying a lot of them are trying to do the right thing. Sometimes it's just public relations. Sometimes it's more systemic change, but it is increasingly on the agenda.
Yeah, and I think Tom makes a good point that businesses are paying much more attention, and I think it's because of two sides. One, it's the costs. Right, you can only have so many hurricanes, you can only have so many forest fires, and you can suddenly find yourself not having any insurance to cover any of these costs that might come from this kind of new environment and climate that you're operating in. So as a consequence, you have to start thinking, maybe I need to change my business model or begin to look, and why and how we could kind of try and do that. And then I think the other side, of course, is that businesses are also realizing there's huge opportunities. And this has certainly been the case, of course, I think in the auto sector, which is the leading sector right now in terms of moving towards EVs and battery-operated vehicles. And around the world, you're seeing a massive shift, right, from all of the major automakers from in North America and Western Europe, as well as in China, right, towards EVs. And they see this as a huge new opportunity in terms of markets and market development for them. And in doing that, then you also, at the last part of this, is that you also see, huge companies as well as new government initiatives and private partnerships in terms of renewable energy itself. Right. This is also one of the huge, big growing fields, and that includes not just the energy utilities themselves, but it's also manufacturing, it's construction, it's transportation. Right. So all of those industries are beginning to realize that there's much more money at probably better costs and better cost structures and better cost long run risks in these new kinds of energies as opposed to remaining in a fossil fuel driven economy.
Oftentimes when we talk about what businesses are doing or not doing, when you look at climate change and the way forward, the term greenwashing comes up, right? How, and Tom, this might come into, it does come into some of what you've been talking about with folks looking at environmental, social governance and reporting around it. Is it easier to cut through the greenwashing nowadays? Is it more difficult? What do you think on this?
I've used ESG reporting in a lot of my MBA classes and having students critically analyze in terms of looking at these reports. It's not difficult to see the greenwashing. It's not saying, and a lot of times what it is, it's a report comes out and a company stresses what they're doing really, really well, and then they don't talk about it all. Some of the systemic issues that they're involved in, like fossil fuel burning organizations talking about something else that they do really well. We're getting better at it in terms of looking at these reports. And I think one of the great things, and as someone who's sat and worked with accountants for a long time, that external validation, having external organizations come in and validate the reports and saying, yeah, this data is correct. Yes, this is what they're proposing to do. And then moreover, people, whether it's professors like John and I or consultants coming in and taking another look at it and providing a little bit more validation. And I think leading organizations are willing to open themselves up from a transparency standpoint and talk about the good things that they're doing, what they're not doing so well right now, and what are their strategies in the long term to try and address what they're not doing well right now.
Yeah, and part of that, of course, is also the fact that we just have much more climate policy on the books, and we have more industrial policy on the books.
Well, it keeps getting built.
Right, and it keeps getting built and built. So the Inflation Reduction Act is a perfect example of this, right? You're not going to get the investments, you're not going to get the tax credits unless you actually show that you're actually building a new type of infrastructure and you're actually hiring people at good wages. And you're not also going to get the money if you aren't also going to be involved in getting people into apprenticeship programs and training programs, right? So all of that comes with different kinds of labor standards and labor conditionalities, right? But by doing that kind of procurement policy, right, and having that kind of oversight, companies can't hide as much as they used to, right? To say, oh yes, well, we're going to be green, simply because we have a new label, right? Instead, they actually have to show the results. They have to show the results in terms of what they're building. They have to show the results in terms of the people that they've employed, and they have to show the results in terms of what kind of jobs that people are getting as well.
Yeah, actually verifiable, right?
Yes.
You're not getting some kind of green check mark or star or whatever you want to call it unless, the details are there.
Yes, exactly.
We've done a number of shows here on the Signal on the quote unquote like just transition, right? As we try to shift the economy, given everything that is going on. From your points of view, looking at where things are at provincially or nationally, How are things moving on the business side of things for this transition? Because I'm sure, and Tom, we kind of talked about this in the preview of the show, just kind of go over a note. Some people will say it's too slow. Other people, for some folks, things, if you're looking at certain wind energy projects, some folks think that's way too fast. Where do you think we are for the case that's being made for where we need to get, where we're saying we need to be?
John, do you want to tackle that one?
Well, there's two sides, of course, right? So what is, how fast are we moving towards a clean energy economy? And that's about decarbonization, right? And that's about how much more renewable energy can we build, and how are we going to transition our industrial processes so that they get off of using, carbon, in terms of, steel making and their furnaces. How much more transit are we going to build? And how are we going to make our buildings more efficient, right? So that's one side of the story. Are we moving very fast on all of those sorts of things? I'd say at least we have policy, but we're not moving there. Every sort of international organization that looks at and assesses and evaluates Canada in a comparative perspective usually puts us somewhere between highly insufficient, or you could put it not doing very much at all, right? Okay, so that's kind of where that side is at, right? So nonetheless, right, there are, right, certainly in Quebec is one of the leaders now here in Canada, both in terms of developing some of that renewable energy, also pushing towards in terms of building efficiencies, getting off gas, and in fact, Quebec is the only province here that's part of an international alliance called Beyond Oil and Gas, and that's to actually make a real commitment to be off of oil and gas by 2050. So that shows that there's a real sense about trying to move that needle forward. In Canada, federally, we have all kinds of new climate acts. That includes not only a Zero Accountability Act, but methane pledges to get off of methane and move forward, as well as, interestingly enough, a Sustainable Jobs Act, right? And this is the other side. It's not just about decarbonizing the economy, but how do we make that transition for our labor force? How do we look after the people who are directly involved in oil and gas industries, right? Either in construction or in engineering or in planning, right? And also at the same time, how do we develop that workforce with the training that's needed, with the involvement to make sure that they have good jobs? How do we make sure that there's going to be the planning and long-term planning to be able to develop those long-term workforces? That's currently in the works. And I'd say 15 years ago, that wasn't in the works, but now we actually have an act. Now we actually have people at the table. The federal government is committed to develop what's called a Sustainable Jobs Act Secretariat to collect the information and to help devise those kinds of policies. Currently, there's councils being developed which involve government, business, and labor representatives to talk about how they're going to be able to move their sectors both nationally, but also in terms of our major regions from Atlantic Canada, Eastern Canada, and Western Canada. So there's progress there. Again, is it fast enough? It ain't fast enough. If we look at where the climate crisis is at, we're supposed to have our emissions, by 2030, and we're only 5.5 years away. On the other side of that is that I'd say there's lots of reasons for optimism that this is the first major initiative and a major transformation in terms of how we think about both industrial policy, but also about our labor market and employment policies and training policies all at once. And I think this is a big step forward.
Yeah, there's no shortage of calls for, for example, we started this week on this show for day one of Climate Week. I had Leah Mary Movell in, and they are the Atlantic Regional Organizer for the Youth Climate Corps campaign. So this is a national call for jobs, green jobs for folks 35 years old and younger and below, right? So you've got this lobbying that is happening. We also have a federal election that's going to be coming by the latest, I think, next October, sometime before then. Could even happen next week, depending on the push alert I just saw from CBC News a little while ago about a non-confidence motion.
What we decided about pensions and politicians' pensions, yes.
Yes, all of that. So the next question I kind of have is...
Adam, could I just...
Oh, yes, sorry.
Not to interrupt, but I just wanted to... John laid a really great foundation, maybe nationally, but I was trying to think of the local kind of impact.
Go for it.
And to me, we got to remember we live in a beautiful, idyllic island. I love how the premier sometimes calls it Canada's version of Hawaii. I'm not sure he spent a lot of time on Canada's version.
January in Newfoundland, and January in Hawaii.
There is a greenhouse at the Botanical Gardens.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And we've done really, really well off the fossil fuel industry. When we look at the amount of tax revenue that's come in, the amount of jobs, especially when you go to rural Newfoundland and you see people who are working on shift work or they've done really well in terms of being contractors, et cetera. There's a lot of wealth that's been generated off fossil fuels. that transition, as John was indicating earlier, becomes difficult. And it becomes difficult not only in terms of jobs, but in terms of lifestyle, in terms of the big house with the big truck and the skidoo and the trike and all those sort of things that are burning a lot of oil. As we make that transition, which we have to because of the climate crisis, that's difficult for individuals. It's difficult, especially maybe not for like the students that we're teaching and who are in their 20s, but if you're in your 50s and 60s and you've lived really well or okay even for the last 30 years, and you're now being asked to maybe give up some of those accoutrements or maybe think about things in a different way, that's hard from a change management standpoint. So for me, I would say it's not maybe occurring as quickly as we can, but there's some psychological, cultural, sociological, systemic barriers to that kind of transition, which I totally understand and I get. I wouldn't want to give up my Ford F-150 or a Ford 350, et cetera, if, first of all, it was necessary for my work and or that's something that I was able to gain from the hard work working in oil and gas that I was able to obtain over the last 30 years.
Is this where the bigger policy sides of things comes into it for the bigger change? Because like everyone here, if everyone in this province keeps driving an F-150 forever, we're not going to make a difference with climate change. But if we're part of like a bigger shift into perhaps it's a conversation about what's going on with the offshore here, which may commit globally. I mean, that's the impact here, or to be part of some national. Again, this shift that is happening of moving away from carbons and fossil fuels into something different. I mean, there is also that side of it. So does everyone have, do we all have to change this way, is my question to you?
I think there's micro, meso, so medium, and then macro changes that have to occur. John mentioned Quebec, and my wife's from Quebec, and I get to spend 2 weeks every year there visiting my in-laws. And Quebec has a really, really good infrastructure in comparison to Newfoundland and Labrador around electrical vehicles and in terms of thinking about that in transition. And that's being driven by Hydro-Quebec, which, culturally, because you see it everywhere. You see these huge transmission lines and how they look at energy is maybe different than what we do. But on the micro, I always say you have to look at all those three levels. You have to look at the macro side, which is the regulation, the change, whether it's in terms of outlawing or alternatively incentivizing, ideally the incentivization to leave rather than the outlawing. At the organizational level, what are the things that you can do as an organization? As someone who used to spend huge amounts of time flying, for example, into different meetings, that's one way of looking at it. I know it's not the same via Teams or Zoom, but that's, once again, kind of at the organizational level. There's some interesting research I know John knows about in terms of looking at hybrid teams and remote teams and how that influences in terms of just commuting. And then that comes also down to our individual level. And we've seen local tech companies, for example, like Misa and other ones that have really been able to take advantage of that opportunity that John was alluding to in terms of looking at how to take advantage of that transition. But that also means that we have to think about, okay, do we make sure instead of having a fossil fuel burning house, which I still have, how do you move that over to electrical or heat pumps or other types of energy? And so I think it's micro, medium, meso, and then macro in terms of the changes that we have to look at.
John, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's hard, right? I think there's no question. I think everyone, when you look at it, you look at the costs, you look at how much has to be built, you look at what your labor needs, right? You look at your demography. I was just in with a government meeting just yesterday called NL Futures, and we're looking at labor market needs and, how that sort of moves forward and what the sort of the, challenges are and how to try to, rethink about, where Newfoundland is at and where it might have to be, if oil and gas, is no longer the driver inside the economy, right? So these are big things, right? But I think what's interesting is that despite all these arguments that we often hear to say that, we can't change, or it's going to take too much effort, or it's going to take too much money. I mean, you only have to go back 30 years and you go, well, there wasn't an offshore oil industry here in Newfoundland, and you built it. And the way you built it was the government said, let's begin to think about how to do this. And then they said to business and they said to labor, let's put a strategic partnership council together. Let's begin to talk about what kinds of investments we're going to need. Let's talk about what kinds of training we're going to need. Let's think about what kind of education we need, what other kinds of infrastructure is going to be required. And then they went out and built offshore platforms. And then as a consequence, the Williams government of the time then took the money that came out of oil and gas and began to invest it into social services and into education and into healthcare services. And
poverty, lots of poverty reduction.
Poverty reduction, right?
Massive. Okay. There was actually, and at that time, one of the envy of the rest of the country for poverty reduction.
It was envy for certainly in terms of how rapid that transition took place. That should be lessons certainly for Newfoundlanders, and I would say that could be a lessons also for Canada, but it's also a lesson in what happened to Alberta as well, right? So if we look at the opportunities that exist with a renewable energy economy, and we put the same kind of leadership, and we put the same kind of money and public money in behind it, and we put the same willingness to collaborate and coordinate with one another, by building new kinds of policies, strategic partnership councils, new labor laws, new training and education, I think we can do it. And you actually are seeing these kinds of initiatives being taking place in many places, in the states, for example, New York State, Chicago, Illinois, Colorado, Washington, all of these places where you would think they would be the last places where you'd see major initiatives take place. Well, that's actually also happening in the United States. Of course, we can expect it more in some of the countries like Denmark and Sweden because they've always had this culture of, highly unionized workforces, much more government, fronting in terms of investment and taking the leadership, right? But even in cases, right, where you wouldn't expect it in the United States, now we're all seeing that people are thinking we do have to come together. We do have to put some money, at the table, and we have to begin to think about how we can work together. And I think these kinds of examples are, really, optimistic to see, and I think they really provide sort of ways that we can also think about